Welcome students, I'm Reinhold Leinfelder from the Institute of Geosciences of the Freie Universität Berlin and of the Rachel Carson Center of Environment and Society at the Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich. We are now in lecture 11, which is our recommendations for research in education. And this time we will only have 2 episodes, the first one with these recommendations, and this will be followed by a final interview again on this topic where we try to see whether there are still open questions. So you will hopefully learn in this episode that the science contract suggested by the WBGU needs strong cooperation between science and society, and also that inter- and transdisciplinarity as well as participation are very important structural requirements for research and education supporting this transformation. Also, we will learn that problem analysis and communication is really a major issue for the transformation, and research and education for the transformation are really strongly interconnected. And at last, we will speak about that we would need some new ways for education and research, which would demand new curricula, new courses, and maybe even new institutions. So let's just start. Content is knowledge-based transformation, requirements for this, the 4 transformative pillars of knowledge society, how we call it, transformative research, transformation research and education, you will see the differences, and then our suggestion list for education. So let's start with the topic, what is a knowledge-based transformation? As we all know, there are a lot of attempts, top-down attempts from the UN, from the individual states, from the G20, from multinational alliances to sort of give frameworks for solving, for creating solutions for the problems of the world, for the global change problems. But we also have learned from all these many conferences that we can't rely alone on top-down. We have to help transformation by various ways. One way to help is bottom-up. There are the NGOs, there are protest movements, there are masterminds and so forth. They are very interesting to come up with new ideas, as we've learned in previous lectures. But they alone also sometimes they are sitting on the same table with the top-down conferences. This alone, and top-down and bottom-up, is not enough, as we have learned. So what we need is really something which we might call the side-by-side level, an intermediate level, where we have dialogue, discourse, new forms of political participation, best practice examples, forerunner companies, dedicated public offices, successful change agents, and so forth. But especially what we need there is a close cooperation of science, research, and technology with the civil society. And from this, we have to sort of create our education also for the transformation. And this is what we are speaking about. And this figure is the way the WBGU puts it in the report. It says we have also different levels. So we have the proactive state, or if we go in the international scale, we have the proactive state community, which of course we do need for framing what we have to do here. We have the economical level here. We have to find out about, we've learned in previous lectures about future economic branches in major transformation fields. We have to raise more money. We need a high investment quota for the transformation and so forth. And then there is the science level. The science technical capacity has to be set in a way that it helps the transformation, and this all is integrated, it's all combined in what the WBGU calls the new social contract for the transformation towards a sustainable society here. And in this contract we have a lot of we need a lot of participation to legitimize all this what we are doing. So this is really a multi-level approach within this what we call a knowledge-based transformation. let me go through the requirements for this. So there are financial requirements, there are structural requirements, and there are content-wise requirements. I'm not going into details as to the financial requirements. You've heard in previous lectures quite something about this, and the financial requirements for research cannot easily be separated from general financial requirements for the transformation. What we need for research there is an upscaling, of course, a focusing, a prioritizing. We need possibilities for long-term research. This does cost money, so we need public, industry, and private money. We also need innovative business models also to raise more money. And this is shown in this triangle on the right side here, that of course the policies have to give the framework for this. All with by help of policies we have to find these new scientific technical capacities, the future economic sectors, and a higher net investment quota. I won't go into more details as to the financial aspect here. Let's come to the next ones, and this is very difficult to separate structural and content-wise requirements for research for the transformation. I will just give you one example. Our goals are our main goals belong global transformation towards a low-carbon society by 2050. This is the overarching goal, but this goal is just a prerequisite for global sustainability as a whole, so this has to be seen in that global sustainability context. Research is needed for that, and the structure, as we heard already in previous lectures, has to be that we have to allow much more systemic research. That means we need much more interdisciplinarity, we need cross-disciplinarity, but we also need international cooperation. We need reflexive research, always readjusting itself, and we need long-term results. And some of the result components then could be, this is already then content-wise, low-carbon innovations, conditions for diffusion, or political strategies. Let's have a little bit closer look here. So need for restructuring research for transformation means, as just said, interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, systemic thinking. That means we have to tackle shared research issues which cannot be solved by sectoral research alone, and we have to combine ecological, technological, and socio-economic aspects in this interdisciplinary research. But what we also need, as I just said in the introduction, a strong push in transdisciplinarity. Since this is a reflective process and a dialogue process, we have to have stakeholder involvement, for instance, for combining scientific and practical existing knowledge. We also need stakeholders and citizen participation to create legitimation for what we do and suggest. We have to foster investment by cooperation of research and development with the business. For this also we need the right people on the table, stakeholders, and of course combined search and reflection process for the future knowledge is necessary, and this only works with stakeholders, with civil society being involved. So we believe, the WBGU believes, that we have to partly reshape the existing research, and we even have to add new fields to it. So we speak in our 4 transformative pillars of the knowledge society of 4 different fields of research and respective education. There is the transformation research with the respective education, and the transformative research with the related education to it. So this again tackles both structural and contents, structural needs and contents. So just to go a bit more into details here, what we mean with transformation research means that the subject of research is the transformation, more or less itself as such. That means we have to identify factors and causal relations for the transformation processes. We have to learn from history. We have to study how we can get the interaction between the society and Earth system and technological development to a more knowledge-based scale. And of course we have to do a lot of research on human preconditions for change. Maybe humans cannot, owing to their biological part in them, cannot think so much into the future, cannot take so much of responsibility. We don't think so, we don't hope so, but we do have to have more research on this. Now, transformative research, on the other hand, means that all research which supports active transformation has to also be put in a systemic context. For instance, new business models, efficiency technology, dissemination, sectoral research, suddenly in this systemic context. Just an example, we develop a new battery, but we better think also how we can distribute it, how we can reach acceptance for a new technology. This is meant with transformative research and respective education. Some examples for transformative research. Here, the example of the energy system. We need research, of course, in the general on the provision of renewables and other zero carbon energies. Research on efficient energy use in all sectors, on low carbon mobility solutions. In earlier lectures, we gave examples for that. We need research on future European power grid and storage technologies, on impediments and barriers for a supranational energy policy, on impact of consumer behavior, and on risk assessment of new technologies, for instance, on carbon capture and storage technology, and so forth. In the field of urbanization, transformative research fields would be, for instance, that we need much more data on urbanization trends. We are only in the beginning here. We need more research on urban culture and lifestyle, more on participation in regional and urban planning, how we can do that. We just can't say that we have to do it. We have to find means how to do it and how to integrate the various aspects, as well as on low carbon regional and urban solutions and so forth. As to land use, another few examples. What we need again are more data on global land use. So we need much more monitoring data. We need better models, really not sufficient by now. We need better scenarios. We need more research on indirect land use changes, on agriculture and climate-friendly diets, on bioenergy use, and so on. Now let's go to some examples for transformation research, not transformative research, but now transformation research. So in principle, our social contract suggestion is a research issue in this aspect. So we need to identify key factors of the transformation, political organizations and legitimacy, legal framework conditions, and so on. Sustainability science and global change research exists already, but we have to scale it up. We have to put it really on a global dimension and better put together the different social spheres and national spheres here. So this has to be scaled up also in the context of transformation research. But what we mean sensu stricto in the true sense here on the transformation research are examples like social transformation processes and transformation ability. Can we do it? Transformation pathways, scope for acceleration, global cooperation and global transformations. What can we learn from previous ones also in problem analysis, problem solving, and problem communication is very, very important in this context. Just a few examples for this transformation research and education. So this example is how can we learn from historical transformation processes. The example is from the Industrial Revolution, and what I'm trying to develop a little bit here is to see how some innovations suddenly cause like an avalanche of other innovation processes here. So let's just start with this here. So think of mechanical looms, which are in use since the 18th century, and so of course they needed agriculture, and for the first time agriculture was not used only to nourish, to feed people, but also to produce cotton. So this went on the way to the clothing industry. You needed energy for that, and this was hydropower. A lot of small dams appeared there, for instance, in northern America here, pushing forward this development towards initial clothing industry. But it was only with the invention, or better to say, with the strong improvement of the steam engine by James Watt, which was in 1784-85 here. So this steam engine suddenly provided so much of energy that you really could put up this clothing revolution, industrial revolution, to a much different level here. Mechanical looms scaled up, used steam engines and so forth. But steam engines, they triggered many other things. They triggered iron ore mining, they triggered smelting industry here, and they also triggered in the wood industry here, because you needed wood for firewood, just for the smelting industry. And this was not all. So now this last set shows you that much more was triggered here. Coal industry was triggered with feedbacks on the steam industry. Railway was triggered using steam industry, and whole naval transportation was triggered again with feedbacks on wood industry and so forth. So that invention first of the mechanical loom, but then especially of the steam engine, really caused this avalanche of innovations, but also caused very, very complex relationships. This is just one of the examples what we can learn about innovations from historical transformation processes. Another one would be development of land area productivity. So what is shown here is how much of land per capita is used to produce an energy turnover, which is shown here in gigajoules per capita n year. So of course, when we go back to the hunters and gatherer times, land use was relatively high. You needed your land just to find your food. It was then already less in agricultural societies and so forth, but still for having different fields, 3-field rotation and so on, you did need your land. And on the way to the industrial society, with all the improvement of the energy turnovers, in this context, we needed less and less land to provide us with our energies for food and for other energy purposes, of course. And now the decision has to be made, and we can reflect about this doing research also. Should we go to a high energy society, which would mean that we might even just think of nuclear energy or so, we can even reduce the amount of land used for energy production? Or if we go back to a sustainability culture, that also a consequence would be that actually we need more land for agriculture, for putting up our wind power and solar power systems and so forth. And we can compare this with the historical data also to learn for the future. My next example is example on problem analysis and communication. How can we tackle this problem? So what researchers do is provide results from their research, and they have to provide this to the society, to the politics in an authentic and differentiated way. They have to say what they know and what they don't know. From this knowledge, which is always a limited knowledge, they often derive scenarios. They also add the statistical likelihoods to it, and this is what the WBGU, for instance, also does, but they also do more like WBGU. They distill recommendations from these scenarios, political, societal recommendations. Best is if we can distill different recommendations, and then society, politics could decide on that. So this would be the ideal view how communication works into the society and into politics. The reality is different. The reality is that, well, we often are moving in that field which is shown here in red. The lack of knowledge, we don't know all, the lack of knowledge is often taken by climate skeptics, by environmental skeptics, by lobbyists to say, well, they don't know enough, why should we already change our behavior? So this is the data which we have, the results which we have are relativized, so and often you hear, let's wait until they know more. Scenarios, they actually can be alarming, but often they are put in a way, or it's said that they are too alarmistic. So this is, there there are other reasons behind this, why the scientists make such alarmistic scenarios. Maybe they just want more research money and so forth. And then as to the recommendations, sometimes the recommendations are just considered again by lobbyists or by others as missionary, saying, well, what they really want is something like a world leadership by science, something like an eco-dictatorship. These are buzzwords which you sometimes hear in these discussions. So the problem is really we have to try to remain in that green field in our communication ways, but we also have to see that reality is different. And one of the ways, just one idea how to tackle this kind of problems is, again, participation. Participation in all this kind of fields, participation in the production of scientific data. And I believe it's a good idea to have citizens involved, especially in monitoring and other research processes here, because not only do we augment our scientific data, but we also legitimize them, and we have people sort of also have some control over it. They see what we do, they see that it's authentic, they see that we don't fake and so forth. I think this is an important thing. It's also important to have not only scenarios which are just designed by a few lines, some projections into the future, but we have to make these scenarios more experienceable and also examine them for acceptance in the public. Museums could help here, model projects here, urban gardening, for instance, and many other ideas are on the table here, but they also only work with the participation of society. And even as to the recommendations, we said in previous lectures that we have a reflective process and science doesn't know enough, so of course the recommendations have to be added by the practical knowledge, by reflections, by discussion. So society should also be probably in an iterative way involved in the recommendation process, or in other words, it's up to the society to choose in which directions we then actually continue into the future. So just to show you one of these examples on environmental monitoring in a bit more detail, we have a project running on a global scale for more than 15 years, which is called Reef Check, where civil society, in this case sports divers and scientists, work together to check out the healthiness of coral reefs and the endangerments of coral reefs. And these data are collected, they are put into other scientific databases, and they are used for monitoring and for writing reports even up to the UN level. And I think we should do something like this on land also. The idea is to come up with participation in environmental monitoring in land entromes, in land areas, so where schools, for instance, could cooperate with scientists from museums, from other institutions, or even companies could cooperate with independent scientists. And we believe that monitoring, especially biodiversity changes, which is relatively easy. You can go down to certain relative simple levels, but also measuring other parameters. Could be an early warning system, but also like a authentication system as to our progress in the transformation towards sustainability. And this data should not be event-like. This data should be really used for science, should be fed in different databases and so forth. And then also we could think of reports for stakeholders and decision makers, which in part also depend on data generated by this participative monitoring. So here I come to our long list of suggestions now, especially towards education. But as I try to show you, research and education are very tightly interconnected, so one is dependent on the other. So we think that it is important to integrate transformation topics into school and university curricula, into vocational qualification and lifelong learning. It's also important to produce teacher training modules for systemic education. We have to help them for these complex systemic topics. Another line of suggestions is thinking now of universities and research institutions. I think we should use the Bologna process for combining transformation-relevant modules and exchange programs. We should even go further and also establish at certain universities transformation science degree courses. We could even establish low-carbon business schools and interdisciplinary faculties, and even could think of establishing national universities for transformation-relevant science and education. As to participation, we believe or we suggest that establishing an extensive program national-wide or further, of course, in other countries, participation in transformation research where citizen science meets institutional science would be really necessary, and as I outlined, participation for monitoring, but also for surveys, for reflections, for developing visions and their realization has to be helped by policies framing possibilities for this. On a UN or at least international scale, it would be really important to develop suitable institutional mechanisms to foster, to push forward this kind of research and education towards sustainability. Dear students, this was the last lecture of the course on the WBGU report on World in Transition, a social contract for sustainability. Thank you.